Usually when I'm talking about platformers on the Amiga, I'm talking about pretty bad games, whether they be lousy rip-offs of another more famous title, or some dreadful creation that got completely blasted by Amiga power or Amiga format or whatever. It's about time to redress the balance somewhat, so let's talk about a good platformer for a change. And this game here is one of my favourites on the whole computer, Arabian Nights. This is a gem of a title made by Krisalis in 1993, the sort that largely contains all of the good things about the oft-maligned Euro platformer subgenre and wraps it up in a neat little package, while also clearly being influenced heavily by the world of consoles. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries, Arabian Nights is the sort of game where, if you showed it to someone who wasn't aware of it, they may not be able to guess immediately that it's running on an Amiga. Indeed, it's one of those fantastic games that perhaps generally too many people aren't aware of, and so I would like to try and redress the balance a little. So, let's dive into it. As previously mentioned, Arabian Nights is a Krisalis software game, the Sheffield-based studio largely made up of ex-Gremlin Graphics people, previously largely known as Teak, and the sort of 90s studio that don't always make the best games, but when they hit pretty damn hard. A lot of Krisalis' work involved working on the audio for Sega Mega Drive games. One of their founders, Sean Hollingworth, made a sound driver for the MD that was used in quite a few games, usually producing excellent results, especially seeing as it was often used by the studio's main composer, Matt Furness. As far as the games themselves go, a lot of their more successful original efforts were based around sports, usually of the licensed variety. Wiley got a license for Jahangir Khan and used it to bring a squash game to market. That was actually a decent effort, and a hit, although their biggest license by far was for Manchester United. The 3 Red Devils-centric footy games they made in the early 90s are certainly amongst Krisalis' most famous and most successful titles, even if they aren't their best. Anyway, we can't really talk about Arabian Nights without first mentioning another one of the studio's best known games, one that combined the worlds of footballing and platforming into a neat little package, that being Soccer Kid. Even if the two games were actually worked on by largely different teams, the similarities between them are readily apparent the moment you look at them. And while Arabian Nights actually came out first, Soccer Kid, or Kid Cleats if you're an American SNES owner, was in development for longer thanks to several delays. The origins for this footy-based actioner actually spawned from one of the studio's earlier titles, the rather okay puzzle-based 1990 platformer Mad Professor Moriarty. According to Matt Furness in a 2024 interview with the Retro Hour, when ideas were being bandied around for a potential sequel to this game, a guy called Dean Lester, then head of Teak's London studio, said that perhaps the Professor should be kicking a ball about. While plans for a Moriarty sequel were soon scrapped, it's this little idea that provided the genesis for what would become Soccer Kid, which was originally known as Football Kid. A bunch of the studio's best and brightest worked on it. Furness, while also providing the music as normal, also had a large hand in designing the game alongside coder Nigel Little. More design as well as the fabulous graphics and animation come from Neil Adamson, and then you've got battle-hardened old veterans, Peter Harrop and Sean Hollingworth also dealing with the programming. Soccer Kid proved to be a hit when it came out in late 1993, a fine game where it takes a little while to get a hang of the football-based mechanics that pepper the action, but it's quite rewarding once you do. It was enough of a hit that it certainly inspired a couple of other studios to create footy-centric platformers of their own, such as Domark's Marco's Magic Football, or US Gold's licensed game based on the Hurricanes cartoon. Neither of these are anywhere near as good as Soccer Kid. But as mentioned, Arabian Nights came first, a few months before Soccer Kid, in the spring of 1993. Now, there's not a whole lot of detail on the game's development, but it's mentioned in a Retro Gamer article on Krisalis that the idea for the game came from Tony Kavanagh, one of Krisalis' co-founders. It's easy to say that the success of Disney's Aladdin film in 1992 probably had something to do with the game's creation, and one imagines it certainly helped. But then this sort of medieval Middle Eastern setting was already a fertile ground for smash hits, what with the almighty Prince of Persia and all that. In the words of the One Amiga's preview, Arabian Nights, which was originally known as Sinbad Jr., Feels like a nice little game to tide people over while Soccer Kid, which again got delayed a bit, gets finished. Still, that feels a bit unfair considering the game's just as good on the quality front, if not better. A relatively small and almost wholly different team worked on Arabian Nights, presumably using either the same or a very similar engine to the one that was used for Soccer Kid. We've got Simeon Pashley and Martin Hebden working on the designing and coding. Hebden's also doing most of the art, and Matt Furness is on the Sonics. That's largely it. Most of Arabian Nights was created by this trio, with a couple of extra credits for the bosses and for the introductory animation, done by Philip Hackney and Les Newstead respectively. The game's plot is simple stuff, but it's delivered well in the intro. You are Sinbad Jr., and your life is spent toiling away in the palace's gardens as a second-class helper of the gardener's assistant. Work is hard, but you live for the glimpses of the beautiful Princess Layla on the palace's balcony. And then one fateful day, the vizier's demon comes along and kidnaps her. After trying but failing to stop the kidnapping, you're blamed for the princess's capture and thrown into the dungeons. And thus your journey begins, escaping, getting a magic carpet, defeating the elemental djinns to obtain access to the vizier's ice palace, vanquishing him, and rescuing Layla. All nice and straightforward, of course. If I had a penny for every European platformer that involved rescuing a fair maiden, well, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd probably have enough money to buy a pint in central London. Arabian Nights uses this plot to bounce our brave hero through 9 levels, and they cover a pretty wide range. Some of them are based around solving puzzles, others are a trifle more actiony, we take a trip underwater, we race around in a minecart, and there's a couple of flying stages too. So no matter what your platforming preference is, chances are pretty good that you'll find something you enjoy here. Indeed, you may well find a lot. Arabian Nights is, for the most part, pretty damn good at all the things it throws at you, and happily it's not the usual Euro platform cliché of aimlessly running about and trying to achieve some quota of gems or coins or chupa chups or whatever in order for an exit to open. Instead, Arabian Nights actually makes exploration rewarding. The main thing that links all of the levels together, regardless of their style, is that there's usually a lot of hidden areas and secrets to find. Sometimes these secrets simply hide currency and points, but there are a lot of collectibles, over 30 in fact. Aside from the usual energy bar increases, extra lives and the like, you can also get permanent energy bar upgrades, upgrades to your movement or your trusty sword, temporary power-ups and various other assorted goodies. Of course, you'll also need the odd item for the quest itself, whenever you come across a little puzzle, most of which are in the classic tradition of something like Dizzy. Nothing that's particularly obscure, just simple logical stuff like finding water in order to make a plant grow, or finding something suitably stiff that can be used to stick into a hole, take some chains down, and rescue a prisoner. You get a percentage score at the end of each level that corresponds to how much you discovered, and while there's no special ending for 100% in every level or anything like that, it's still worthwhile. You can go through the levels as quickly as you like, but generally they're levels that aren't so long that they outstay their welcome, but they're also not mind-numbingly shallow and straightforward. It's a very cleverly designed little game, happily one of those where you really want to play the levels a hell of a lot more than just once. All that's well and good, but Arabian Nights is also a damn good mover. So often it's the case in a European platformer, particularly one with smatterings of the age-old arcade adventure micro-genre like this one, that the interesting levels are handicapped by frustrating controls where you're too fast, you're too slow, the jump-in's all wonky and so on. Here though, well, it's just right. Just right in the sense of playing a perfectly good console game in that there's nothing spectacular to say. Sinbad moves at a decent pace, there's the right amount of Mario-esque momentum, and his jumps are very controllable. And he can even defend himself. Sinbad has a sword for that purpose. Usually his best tactic is to lure the enemy into attacking, and then coming back in for a quick swipe. It's a little Prince of Persia-esque in this regard, or at least it certainly feels like it in the first dungeon level, which is a cartoonier homage to Mechler's classic where you're taking out those guards and avoiding the odd trap while learning the game's ropes. Getting caught in a trap, isn't necessarily fatal. This isn't one of those Euro platform games where a sudden fall into spikes equals instant death, as you have an energy bar and you're almost always able to get out and try again. If you do cop it, then you don't usually get sent back all that far, and you start with a maximum of 5 lives. Still, there are no continues, so there is a bit of bite there, although that doesn't matter quite as much when the game doesn't feel like a slog. On the difficulty front, yeah, there's a fair bit of that. The first couple of levels start you off easy enough, but it does ramp up quite sharpish once you get into the maze-like galleon and the mines, and the last couple of stages are seriously not going to muck about. The final stage in Lavizier's Ice Palace is obviously pretty large, full of the toughest enemies and, well, it's an ice level, so obviously it's going to be a challenge from the get-go. But happily it's a challenge that's at the end, where it should be. There are only the odd parts where the game does fall down a little, in particular the 2 magic carpet stages. Yeah, these are pretty damn rubbish. Having momentum on the carpet in these shoot 'em up stages is very annoying indeed. There's not much to shout about here on the graphical front, and all the enemies tend to take far too many hits to actually blow up, so you're better off just trying to avoid them as opposed to engaging with them, which simply isn't going to do. The minecart stage is also a bit of a pain. While you don't actually have to win the race against the unmanned cart you're up against, there is a time limit, and it can be a pain to actually stay on the damn thing, although the level is short. But the underwater stage, now that's actually a damn good one. You get to swim about and do a lot of exploring, and the young Sinbad here just so happens to have unlimited lung capacity, so there's no risk of drowning. So while the diversions into areas like shoot-em-ups and racing, of a sort, do fall down here as they often do in platform games, especially Euro ones, Arabian Nights does manage to nail the underwater level when a lot of other platformers don't. And then you have the bosses. These are pretty nondescript on the whole, simple enough once you've figured them out, and that doesn't take too long. Far from the best part of the game, but they aren't offensive. Graphics-wise, the game is fine. As can surely be seen, it's pretty close in style to Soccer Kid, particularly when it comes to the main sprite. Undeniably, Soccer Kid has busier, more detailed and generally better graphics, and that hero obviously has more animation, seeing as he's got the ball to kick about and all of that. But while Arabian Nights isn't necessarily the best looking platformer in the world, it's not bad in the slightest. Indeed, the graphics are nice without being busy, and not filled with endless layers of parallax that can sometimes interfere with the action. I mean, geez, what with this game only having parallax scrolling in things like the background where they don't get in the way, sometimes you wonder if Arabian Nights is actually of European origin. Is it all some sort of trick? A bit of flim-flammery disguising the presence of guys from a country that actually knows how to make platform games? All of that said, the best thing about the whole game, I think that might well be the music. Now it's funny how this is so often the case when a certain Matt Furness is involved. He is quite like Tim Follin in that there are plenty of generally middling games, or even terrible ones, that are worth firing up simply for his soundtrack alone. This is often the case for his work on Mega Drive titles. Here though, we have a case where the quality of the game is a match for his sublime sonics, and it's a beautiful partnership indeed. It's so often the case for games with this sort of setting to feature nothing but a load of cliched Middle Eastern motifs, all at mock sitar and what have you, and while those sort of melodies are dotted around, they're incorporated into a heart-pumping and speedy soundtrack that pairs perfectly with the action. And, unlike so many Amiga games, You get both the music and the sound effects, and you don't have to choose between one or the other. And this is A500, it's not an Arga game or anything like that. I honestly reckon it's one of Matt Furness's best ever soundtracks, even if it isn't necessarily one of his best known ones. But then this isn't necessarily one of the best known games, which is quite the shame. The game itself did fine, particularly on the critics front. Every one of the major British mags gave Arabian Nights scores between 90% and 80% without exception, a feat that the game repeated the following year when it was re-released onto the CD32. With this game, as well as Soccer Kid, which got even better critical notes, Krisalis showed just how good they could be in the world of platformers, and in retrospect you really wish they'd made more of them. While they concentrated so much on sports titles, and that business did well through the 90s, these games are absolute bangers to the point where if Krisalis had made more like them, they may be thought of in the same breadth as the likes of the bitmaps, and that's not something I'd say lightly. It obviously doesn't help that the game never left the Amiga. Its only console appearance was, as mentioned, on the CD32, and as is often the case, that version is just about identical to the original floppy disk version. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of work on a Mega Drive or SNES version, so one presumes that it simply wasn't considered. It's not an odd mystery title like the Mega Drive version of Soccer Kid, something that was actually reviewed in one of the magazines before disappearing into the void, yet to be recovered. Still, this is absolutely a platformer you should go and play, even if you have a general distaste for the European style. There's enough that's different from the norm, and more than enough that's special about Arabian Nights to make it worth anyone's while. For my money, it's one of the best platformers you can get on the Migi. And, well, it's simply nice to cover a good platformer on the computer for a change. Hopefully you've enjoyed this little video, and until the next time, bye for now.